let's talk about Imperial Germany. The western part of Europe had a history of absolutist states. At the same time, there was a rise of the middle classes, the service classes of the gentry, and the slow emergence of capitalism from the 14th and 15th century. It started with the rise of commerce and investments in numerous overseas projects, also commercialization of agriculture in Britain and France. But in Central and Eastern Europe, of which Germany is a part, the feudal ruling class was always powerful. The king, unlike Western European countries, Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, etc., could never in Germany become too autonomous and powerful, because the king or the monarch was an elected representative in Germany. He was elected by a school of German feudal lords or knights. Therefore, the huge importance of these feudal lords in Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was the remnant of the Holy Roman Empire, none of these very big name houses could actually become too independent and powerful because of the predominance of feudalism in Germany. Perry Anderson, in his Lineages of Absolutist State, he argues that there was a contraction of the feudal pyramid and a centralized feudal state with a contracted feudal ruling class emerged in Europe during the transitional phase from feudalism to capitalism. In Germany, the absolutist kingdoms were very strong and the bourgeoisie was weakened by a further strengthening of feudalism in the early modern period. The river Elbe acted as a natural border between West Germany and the lands covering Eastern Germany, stretching all the way to Russia. In these eastern territories of Europe, serfdom was expanded and even imposed on free peasants during the early modern period. This process is called Second Serfdom and strengthened feudalism and the late feudal aristocracy. The bourgeoisie in Germany had to remain autonomous in a sea of feudal authority. Cities like Bremen, Hamburg, Lübeck, these were important areas of commerce, but the bourgeoisie here had to always be answerable to the extremely powerful feudal vestiges. Now, the vanishing of knighthood was a very important phenomenon. It meant the waning of feudal cultures of chivalry, the mix of which had a kind of, an honorable culture in place. It was enjoyed by the upper classes of society with extreme violence and looting directed at those below them. Their disappearance effectively remained, it meant a contraction of the feudal pyramid, as we were talking about in the explanation of Anderson. It reduced the size of feudal landlords and also the centralization of the state power. The demands of the reorganized feudal lords on the peasants were changing and becoming even more predatory. In the face of more and more surplus extraction by the feudal lords, there was an uprising of peasants in 1524-5 in German-speaking regions, and this was crushed by the combined armies of the princes. We all know about Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer. He spoke up against corruption and oppression of the Catholic Church, supported the princes. The Catholic Church was the biggest landowner in Europe and a champion of feudalism in words and deed. It provided ideological sanction to the feudal order. The Protestants broke away from it. Yet, except for the radical reformers, the Lutheran Reformation sided with the princes against the peasants. The Kingdom of Prussia was the strongest and the largest late feudal state among the German principalities in the 18th century. The Prussian state reached the heights of power and influence under Frederick the Great or Frederick II of the Hohenzollern dynasty. The size of the army increased. In the early 19th century under Napoleon, the German regions were occupied by France. Ideas of liberalism and concrete experience of a modernized bourgeois governance now visited the German regions. In the German lands, French military occupation and Napoleonic authoritarianism was resented by the emerging bourgeois and petty bourgeois intelligentsia. But they admired and wished to adopt the anti-feudal bourgeois elements present in the Napoleonic dispensation. Napoleon's Grand Army was ultimately defeated here, yet the ideas associated with the French occupation gained ground and encouraged the forces of popular democracy in Germany. Tired of living under absolutist feudal aristocratic principalities, they now wanted to adopt the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. In 1848, following the February Revolution in France, segments of the German population would rise. In 1844, in Prussia, there was an uprising of weavers in the district of Silesia. Hunger and loss of livelihood had made them rise against the king. The aborted weavers' uprising, it inspired the German revolutions of 1848. So, the revolutionary risings that we are talking about, it was led by radicals and liberals among the German intelligentsia. It did not lead to the overthrow of the late feudal absolutism. They failed to take power. So Germany was unified under the leadership of the late absolutist aristocrats, namely the big landlords or the Junkers who ruled Prussia. The liberal bourgeoisie in Germany carried the burden of weakness of the bourgeoisie as a class from the early modern era. In 1848, the liberals had joined the radical democratic elements, but when the forces of popular democracy were crushed by the German aristocracy, they switched sides and aligned with the late feudal absolutist forces. So they were relegated to the sidelines in the unification process. It was the late absolutist forces under Prussian leadership which unified Germany. In 1870, the Prussian army defeated France. This paved the way for the unification of Germany. We have to take into account certain feature of this Kaiser Reich, R-E-I-S-C-H, an ultra-conservative and a late imperialist nationalism. It was a feature of post-unification state. Various state-sponsored institutions and ideological apparatus at the disposal of this very state, it encouraged a kind of a nationalist chauvinism, akin to what we saw in France as well. Every state depends for its existence on coercion and consent. Louis Althusser, a French Marxist thinker, has pointed out while the repressive apparatus like the police and army are deployed for physical and authoritarian control, religious, educational, and social institutions, these are often used to induce a kind of, slavery to the state at the ideological level. Nationalism in post-1870 period under the Kaiser Reich emerged as a much more significant force than it had been in the previous era. At the time of unification, Germany had 4 kingdoms, 6 grand duchies, 5 duchies, 7 principalities, 3 cities which were free, including Hamburg, Bremen and Lübeck, 7 principalities, and an imperial territory of Alsace-Lorraine, which was initially a French territory and was always a node of contention between France and Germany. So this was the geographical extent of Germany. Ethnic, regional and religious diversity was a characteristic feature of Imperial Germany. National allegiance was demanded from every subject through these social and religious institutions in post-unification Germany. This was a way of imposing a uniform identity on the population and a stick to be used against national minorities and all those who were critical of the German state. Prussia, as the largest state, had the upper hand. Prussian leadership had led to unification. Prussia's king had become the emperor. Its capital, Berlin, was chosen as the capital of the country. Prussian military and administrative models formed the ironclad structure of this entire imperial order. Now, we have to study about two institutions of the Kaiserreich. The state, is an abstract entity. Its power is realized only through the government. Modern governments are formed on the basis of constitutions. The constitution of the new German Empire provided two national political institutions. One was the Bundesrat. The federal states were represented in the federal council called the Bundesrat, and the Reichstag. What was this? The other national political representational institution was the Reichstag, or the German version of the parliament. First, in the Bundesrat, it was a nominated upper house, almost like our Rajya Sabha, and it preserved the interests of the pre-unification aristocratic elite by guaranteeing them representation. It functioned like the House of Lords, the upper house of parliament, like our Rajya Sabha or the House of Lords of Britain. Theoretically, each state was sovereign, but in practice it was dominated by Prussia. So the centrality of Prussia is something that you have to keep in mind here. The other national political representational institution, as we know, was the Reichstag. It consisted of elected representatives. They are elected on the basis of universal man franchise. All men aged 25 years could vote as candidates, but it did not include women. At the same time, it was designed to force national identity and encourage the growth of democratic civic culture. Reichstag had significant budgetary powers and judicial or lawmaking powers. Still, this elected body's decision-making powers were weakened by the German ruling class, who was sitting in the Bundesrat and also with the king's house and the king's court. The role of political parties, a feature of liberal parliamentary rule, was curbed. Real power and key decisions were taken by the Junkers and by Germany's late absolutist ruling class. Let's look at the social composition of the ruling class. Of course, the Junkers, the big late feudal aristocratic landlords, mainly in Prussia, they were closely aligned with the emergent sphere of German big business and the banking sector. During the first 20 years, you can see here in the screen as well, in the first 20 years between 1871 to 90, the ruling class was dominated by the agrarian lobby by the Junkers. From 1890s, the bankers or the financiers who owned banks and industry, they controlled the politics. So the Junkers became secondary, not entirely but to a great extent, from the last decade of the 19th century. This was because after unification, agrarian surplus was invested as capital in industry through the mediation of large monopolistic banks. Junkers encouraged this process since they wished to grow rich by investing the money made through commercial agriculture organized along capitalist lines. This in turn led to the growth of large banks, and the financiers became so powerful that they were in a position to dictate terms to the Kaiser and the Junkers from the 1890s. The Kaiser was the ruler, by the way, the king of Germany. The state was still dressed in late absolutist regalia, but in reality, it was the German big bourgeoisie which controlled its functions with the help of the Junkers. Theoretically, the emperor was the first among equals, presiding over other powerful aristocrats. His powers were fixed by the Constitution of 1871, but this constitution was once again an eyewash. Foreign policy, declaration of war and peace. He was the supreme warlord who could do all of these things. He could control appointments in administration. The army was under his command. But in practice, this, a lot of this power was slowly being appropriated by the German ruling class in his name. And the Kaiser, from the 19th century we see, he's moving increasingly towards maintaining an imperialist orientation. Kaiser Wilhelm I remained steeped in Prussian traditions, and his grandson Wilhelm II tried after 1888 to expand his role as an imperial German monarch with direct support from the German ruling apparatus. That is the Junker military combine, the big businessmen comprising monopolistic bankers and industrialists, and also arms manufacturers. See, the role of arms manufacturers and their close alliance with the ruling elites has to be kept in mind. Why? Because who supplied Hitler with so many concentration camps, which was basically instruments which would, emit gases, harmful gases to suffocate the people? Those were mass execution chambers manufactured by these arms manufacturers. Hitler had so close ties with them because of a very long intercourse and alliance of these arms manufacturing businessmen and the German ruling elites. So capitalism has this ugly face. They would sell anything that would get them money. But at the same time, it's important that we keep in mind the different forces, capitalism, socialism, communism, all of this coexist. Otherwise, how would we know what to choose from if none of these, can exist in a order? At least in democracy, I believe that all of these different groups with differing ideologies and sometimes radically different orientations should coexist at the same time in the same country, so that we can have a broad array of options to choose from. But yes, the extent to which these will grow, that has to be, taken care of by us, the people of our country. The tendency to amalgamate national identity with imperial identity became pronounced from Wilhelm II's time. Now, we would look into some of the autocratic principles taken by Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, the pioneer of German statecraft. An autocratic form of rule existed for all practical purposes, delinked from but accommodating a legislature based on liberal bourgeois constitutional principles. It was the outcome of the tactical alliance of Bismarck with liberal nationalists between 1866 and 1870. But in the course of the 1870s, German rulers led by Bismarck broke with many of the liberal allies and engineered a split in the National Liberal Party. The liberal bourgeoisie, which was historically weak, could not gain ascendancy. Bismarck and the Junkers projected imperial rule as standing above partisan divides, as standing above parties. Despite having adopted a constitutional form of government, Germany was a monarchical dictatorship. The ruling class managed to bypass laws passed in the legislature on various issues like, a lot of national issues. It was done by managing the shifting terrain of coalition-based political parties. The German Chancellor Bismarck, a Prussian Junker, managed to control and get the shifting coalitions to support the imperial ruling class. By the late 1880s, Bismarck was unapologetic in his efforts to shore up conservative forces to support the state against mounting opposition. Bismarck was against many Catholic socialists, and three such parties that he had issued serious repressive measures against were the Catholic Party, the German Socialist Party led by August Bebel, and the German Center Party. He launched a Kulturkampf, or a cultural war, against the socialists who were shown as internal enemies. Hailing from the Junkers, Bismarck was so against the Catholics that one of the main policies he took was to bring down the Catholic clergy and nobility to the heel. Mind you, the Catholics were conservatives. They were royalists in orientation, and Bismarck was a Republican. I'm not saying he was democratic, but he wanted the Republican model of government to prevail in Germany, and he succeeded to a great extent. He was the sole man on whom the monarchy came to depend for many of the external wars, like Sedan, the unification of Germany under Prussia, and a lot of things. So, a lot of anti-socialist steps were taken by Bismarck. On the eve of the First World War, the Kaiserreich established a truce and brought the SPD, the German Socialist Party of August Bebel, over to its side. A new phenomena we see by 1914 is that the socialists now adopted social imperialism. Marx called this social imperialism. What was it? They internalized the logic of capitalism-driven imperialism, and their doctrine was described as social imperialism by Marxist radicals in Germany. So they realized that imperialism of Germany will be there and they can't do anything about it. But what they can do is to bring on a rather socialist turn within these, colonial processes, so as to ensure that their voices were heard. So that's the imperialist turn of the socialists that we see by 1914. Expansion of state power. What happens? At the cost of non-German speaking minorities who were living in the nation states' border areas, like the Poles, the Lithuanians and others, the Prussians were establishing a kind of a forcible Protestant Germanization, which was of course resisted by all the other smaller principalities. So at the face of German nationalism, there were so many dissident voices who were resisting this central Germanization attempt. Peter Gay, who is a cultural historian, worked extensively on Germany and Austria, has observed Germany underwent Protestant secularization during this period. Lutheran Christianity was privileged through statecraft. Technically, the state promised freedom of religion to Catholics, Jews, and religious minorities. The anti-Semitic practices were weakened under Kaiserreich, so a positive step. But slowly, from 1890s, we would see anti-Semitic political parties would come up under a single racist umbrella. Many have seen the germs of German fascism or Nazism in these formulations. So, despite a positive step taken by the Kaiserreich in the initial period when progressive secularization was adopted and anti-Semitism was weakened, now from 1890 once again we would have the seeds of the Nazi Holocaust or the principles of anti-Jewish philosophy. Jews are so bad they need to be killed. Such things. Slowly they would be coming up from this particular period, from the 19th century itself. It didn't happen overnight. Hitler didn't come overnight. It happened from this period onwards, when there was a renewed phase of fascist, Nazist formation. Okay, and this was of course aided by a rampant increase of racial sciences or eugenics, supported by imperialist expansion through war. Also, the army was used as an instrument of authoritarian consolidation of state power. The size of the army under the Prussian state had kept increasing from the 18th century. The Prussian army formed the core of the German Imperial Army, just as Prussia formed the brain and heartland of the new nation state. Social militarism was promoted by the Junkers or the military aristocracy. State power too was transmitted to these armies and all. Lutheran Church was at the center, as at the service of the state from the time of Martin Luther himself. The state levied taxes on Protestants to finance the church. The priest from his pulpit glorified the monarchy. So all the instruments were actually propagating the state's power. And the Kaiser or the monarch, the scion of the Hohenzollern dynasty, was the father of the people. anointed by God. That was the ideal propagated by the church, and this is called Hohenzollern Caesaropapism, where power of the dynasty merges with that of the church. I think this was against the segmentary state model provided by D.D. Kaushambi, but no, I mean, don't write this in your exam. This is just a comment that I made. But yeah, we had this increasing alliance of the state and the crown. Finally, we come to the scramble for Africa, in which Germany was a part. So a Berlin to Baghdad projection was being made by Germany, that Germany's prestige had to be elevated so much that it would form a great empire from Berlin to Baghdad in the Middle East. This plan of building a German-controlled Greater Middle East was matched by the German big capital's successful domination over the late Habsburg and Ottoman empires. The economies of these two old empires came to be controlled by the German big business and financiers. That's why they would join the First World War as subordinate allies of Germany. So Middle Africa was the aim, which galvanized many of the German businessmen to go to Africa and carve out regions from Central to East Africa. 10,000 people were massacred in what has been called the Herero Massacre, because in Namibia, the German settler colonialists engaged in brutal land grabbing. Lands of Namibia were grabbed by the Germans. The result was an uprising of the Hereros between 1904 to 8, and this uprising was brutally suppressed. The massacre is considered the first major imperialist genocide perpetrated by Imperial Germany. 100,000 people were killed in this Herero uprising, and this was the process for the wider scramble for Africa that the European states, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, all of them had engaged in. It's unfortunate, but it was true. Another thing that we have to look at is the rapid economic transformation that strengthened the German state. Just as blood and iron, we had the coal and iron ideology propagated by the Junker aristocracy. The investments in and expansion of heavy industry made way for rapid industrialization. This was made possible by the huge growth of finance capital and its mediating role in investing the capital accumulated in the agricultural sector into industry and commerce. Initially, heavy industry comprising of coal and iron was regarded as the industrial sector. Later, chemicals, glass, engineering and armaments industry developed on the basis of heavy industry and a monopolistic banking sector. The industrialization of Germany was preceded by the spread of technical education, with engineering colleges established in many cities. And finally, the Zollverein. The Zollverein was the customs union which removed tariff over transport of commodities between a group of German states. This was the biggest thing that had set Prussia aside of other German states. The partial economic unity and the growing power of military coalition of the North German Confederation of Protestant states led by Prussia was seen as stepping stones towards political unification later in the century. Zollverein meant expansion of trade, commodity production and revenue resources of the state. Gradual waning and legal abolition of serfdom enabled the commercialization of agriculture. So new cities grew, towns were coming up, which meant overcrowded slums without basic amenities. Once again, something that we see in France, in industrial Britain, high mortality among the poor families and oppressive working conditions. So with the rise of the industrial German state, we had the ills also coming up, the dire conditions of the laborers. Various democratic governments emerged within Germany as well. It's not that we are just talking about the negatives of Germany, so let's not get brainwashed into thinking that Germany doesn't have or had a democracy in place or democratic struggles. In fact, all of these criticisms are stemming from the fact that there were voices that were constantly criticizing the Kaiser and the Third Reich, and We had a plethora of movements emerging from Germany, playing significant roles in organizing workers and women in the course of the 19th century. They were active in the public sphere and in the wider society through popular democratic associations. Women's organizations came up, trade unions came up. This was evident in the internal challenges to state authoritarianism in the late 19th century, as workers and feminists challenged class and patriarchy upheld by the Kaiserreich. That's it that I had to say about Germany. So let's meet